Good evening. You're watching or listening to Redwood Wonk. My name is Eric Kirk, and this week I have Dr. Aaron Donaldson with me to discuss the political news of the day. And we're going to start with what seems to be growing in terms of the extent of sentencing of the people associated with January 6th. Now, maybe it's because these are the more complicated cases and they've taken so long to evolve. But as of yesterday, Enrique Tarrio, the leader of the Proud Boys, was sentenced to 22 years for seditious conspiracy. That's pretty serious. That is, it's not everything. It could have been up in the 30 years, but it is a serious prison sentence. A couple of other Proud Boys received 17 and 15-year sentences. These are the longest sentences that have happened so far. I believe there was another one that was about where the other two were a few months ago. Early on, it seemed like a lot of the sentences were pretty light. Judges were even criticizing the prosecution for not asking for more. We're talking 2-3 years, and then they started to get bigger. And particularly as the more violent people have come in. But this is the Proud Boys have been seen by some as potentially connected to Trump and the Eastman crowd, although we haven't seen anything like that yet. But maybe these guys will go for some sort of deal. I don't know. Do they really want to be in jail that long? Do they really think that Trump is going to be elected next year and will pardon them, as he's promising to do? Although he's not promising to pardon everybody. He's sort of saying, well, some of the real bad apples, I'm not going to pardon. Well, who is that? And we'll talk a little bit about why these sentences are so long and how this is serious, and then some of the reactions to it, positive and negative. Aaron.
So I just want to start with one of the things that you said, which is that a lot of people early on when the sentences were coming down for January 6th were kind of surprised that the sentences were pretty light. And if we back the camera up, or the film tape back up even further than that, what we have is an open and, make no mistake, violent insurrection at the United States Capitol. And then the people responsible for that, walk away. Like in other countries, if you do that, you go to jail and prison. And when we see, civil unrest at peaceful protests and things, the people responsible for that will be arrested that day and thrown to the paddy wagon. And I'm not a big fan of the prison industrial complex, but I do think that it was alarming to see how many people that were responsible for so much, destruction and a genuine invasion on our democracy, they were allowed to walk away from that event without ever facing law enforcement. It took the DOJ doing a fairly complicated investigation and series of prosecutions. And early on, when the prosecutors were asking for sentences, the whole time we're doing the best we can to kind of kid gloves the question that this is a political prosecution, but it's not a political prosecution from the left. The left did not start this prosecution.
No.
This is a political prosecution because folks on the right refuse to accept the results of an election and all of the judicial process that has followed from that election. They just refuse to accept that. And when they refuse to accept that in the name of their candidate, Donald Trump, and they storm Congress, then it becomes kind of a quasi-political thing. And so we have seen the DOJ and all sorts of other folks proceeding with just the utmost of care and the utmost of concern, the kind of nuance that you would never see for folks that are protesting a Black Lives Matter movement or potentially fighting for the climate. Those folks are not going to get this nuance and care because here what we have is a partisan event, but it is one that is started from the right. And so we have to try to coddle this a little bit to insulate the mechanisms of government from the criticism that the Biden administration is hunting down his political rivals, which is clearly not what we're seeing. And so personally, I think it is surprising that it has taken this long. And also, this news is potentially going to get buried because when you look at what Trump is facing, it's a lot. And in particular, with this case, with the Proud Boys, from what I understand, Democracy Now! Was reporting that the prosecution in that case was like explicitly characterizing the Proud Boys as like Trump's army.
Right.
And there's like,
what was it? Stand back and
yeah,
stand
back
down
and stand down. This is a very particular kind of statement. And even if it's flippant or offhand, like, wow, the consequences for this statement in a debate. I'm a debate coach, and I am a huge fan of this particular statement because it seems like just a simple question and a simple thing he said, but the consequences are huge. And I do think that when you look at what Trump is facing, it's going to make a lot of these sentences look fairly small, even in of themselves. I don't know that he'll serve all that time or whatever, but it'll be interesting to see kind of how maybe it's just setting the table for what's coming next. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I don't know. I'm wondering if Trump leaves the country at some point, but we'll see.
It would not surprise me. He has the plane. It's almost like he has the plan.
Yeah. I mean, Tario is interesting because he did show some remorse, or at least pretended to.
He did, and then he didn't, apparently. When the judge was out and he was being let out, he apparently shouted out Trump won or something like that at the last minute.
Was that Tario? I thought that was one of the others.
Oh, I could be wrong about that. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's, and not all of them are showing remorse. I mean, there's a guy right now who's facing trial, and he just got himself 5 months of contempt for, he's representing himself. He's one of the more violent January 6th protesters. And as soon as the contempt ruling came down, he didn't hesitate. He just called it the Nazi court, right? Which is not what you want to say to the judge who's like, no. But they just have this sense of entitlement. And as if they have the right to do this stuff. And again, it's very important because and one of the reactions I'm seeing on the internet, again, I participate in forums with people who are conservative, who are Trump supporters and the like. And I got onto Facebook yesterday morning, and this morning, and there was a post which read, 22 years for a crime where he wasn't even present at the scene of the crime, as if that means something, right? Well, of course, Charles Manson wasn't at the scene of the crime, right? I mean, many of the Nazis at Nuremberg were not convicted for what they did themselves physically. It's for what they ordered, for what they did. They weren't present at the scenes of the crime.
And in this case in specific, it's worth asking, why wasn't he at the scene of the crime? Was he potentially incarcerated in another place for another kind of similar situation? I'm just hypothetically asking questions here. But what we find is that is part of the reason he wasn't at the scene of the crime. It's a very truncated version of the truth.
Well, you do, and you don't have to be at the scene of the crime if conspiracy is alleged, if you're an accessory, if it's racketeering. It's all a general plan. Gangsters routinely are not at the scene of the crime. They order a hit, and then should we not charge them with murder later because they didn't actually physically do it? I mean, but that is where we're at right now, and they seem to be, and literally the person was first in denial and then genuinely shocked. And first he said Charles Manson was there. It's like, no, he was not where Sharon Tate was anyways. I mean, it's just and so it's a very interesting thing, but all we keep hearing about is the weaponization of this, and this is all being enabled by not just Trump but other Republicans who do not want to take a stand here. And when McCarthy says this is all weaponization and political and the rest, he is basically undermining the judicial, the criminal justice system. At that point, he is undermining confidence from people who traditionally have been pro-cop, prosecution and the rest, but it boggles the mind. But 22 years, it should be a shock. that Donald Trump was found by a unanimous jury to have forcefully fingered a woman and then defamed her about it. Should have been a shock. But no, they say, you can get a jury verdict anytime. As somebody who has done jury trials and won and lost them, I'm telling you, a jury verdict is not an easy thing to get. And especially if you've got the burden of proof. And so we have these sentences coming down, but depending on what your politics are, you're going to see it in a completely different light. And there is, unfortunately, people out there who just believe that. I mean, I've questioned the legitimacy of the system in a lot of times. I think it's inadequate. I think it's got, a lot of inherent racism and class biases. I think that district attorneys sometimes go overboard with their charging. And just basically charge because the arresting officers want them to do that. I've watched officers lie on the stand, and it's really frustrating when you cross-examine them, and even when you kind of prove that they're lying, there are still juries that go right along with them. What happened to that? It's just the transformation of it. But again, it's limited. Anybody else who gets prosecuted deserved it, but these people, they're victims.
We're going to talk about the selective interpretation of the way that the law should work in the next segment, I'm pretty sure.
Sure.
But one thing I'll say about this is that when it comes to just the way justice typically works, if you look at Fani Willis, if you look at Georgia in particular, the same grand jury that indicted the Trump crew has also recently indicted a bunch of activists that are protesting something called Cop Town there. Mm-hmm. And they're using, the conservatives are using a lot of the same justifications that we just heard from you to just round up a whole bunch of people for like handing out flyers, trying to stop, the militarization and the policification of their community. And this is all free speech. This is the weaponization of justice in the eyes of many. But this isn't something that we hear included in this concern about the weaponization of justice. What we do hear when people say that they feel like right now Donald Trump and the right are being hunted down by Joe Biden, if you know someone out there saying this or you yourself feel this way, there's at least two things you need to know. First and foremost, this is not new. This is the party of lock her up. This is the party that investigated Hillary Clinton and every single member that they could find of the Obama administration. They did everything they could. And if they could have indicted them, they probably would have. They just didn't have any of the evidence, or they were lousy at what they were trying to accomplish. One of those two things are true. And what we have instead is that here there's like legitimate teeth. There's actual teeth. When a political party shows up and says, hey, I think our opposition is a problem, it's not because they're targeting their opposition. It's because their opposition stormed Congress when Congress was trying to ratify.
Half of them posted their confessions on Instagram.
And shared it on social media. It was all very public. It was very public. And so I think that when people say this is the weaponization of justice, that's a very selective interpretation, and it's one that ignores, again, what I said, the fact that these folks were given like kid glove treatment for a long time. Typically, justice comes down hard and swift, and it really doesn't care about your what ifs and free speech. It just puts you all in prison, and that's what we're seeing potentially with a lot of these folks trying to stop Cop Town. The other thing that's really frustrating for me about this line, that it's the weaponization of justice, that is not how a grand jury works.
That's right.
The Biden administration is allowed to try to indict a ham sandwich, but it is up to the jury to indict the ham sandwich. And there's this old saying that, you can indict a ham sandwich. And part of my statement when I hear that is like, well, if a grand jury returns an indictment on a ham sandwich, then suddenly I'm interested in that ham sandwich. I'm not saying it's guilty, but suddenly it's to me like that's a suspicious sandwich. That's all I'm saying.
Unfortunately, it was a New York City judge that made that ham sandwich comment, and it's not something that the right wing would be repeating now. This, was if there wasn't this specific context. I've learned in the past couple of years that the FBI is a left-wing organization. That J. Edgar Hoover was a left-winger.
Liberals everywhere are just shocked by this, and also at the same time they're like, we need the FBI to step in. What am I saying?
I know. Well, that as actually an elder activist explained it to me. He said it's kind of was the where a lot of us were in the '60s during the civil rights movement. We didn't trust the federal government, but we wanted them to come down on the states, and it was a contradiction that we had a hard time dealing with, and it's this way now too. I mean,
there's a deep history here.
Yeah, it definitely is, and I don't know how many more people are on. I don't think that there's probably going to be any longer sentence than the 22 years. The violent people are getting the prosecutors asked for 33 years for each of these latest ones, but prosecutors routinely ask for more than they expect to get. It's it's kind of like when you're bidding, you ask for a better price than you think you're going to get. But I'm going to let you close this one out, Aaron. You got any thoughts?
Yeah, my parting thoughts here is that, like, I'm a debate coach, and when I study debates, the way that we characterize the debate is very important. They're saying there's a weaponization of justice going on, and they're saying this is a politicized witch hunt. This is all coming from the right. And, we can say, again, what I said at the top of the segment, that there are politics deeply involved here. The politics involved here is a particular party refusing to admit that they lost an election and a whole lot of court cases that are required to prove that an election has been stolen. Not just the election, but also all of the various means that they have to prove that it's been stolen. They lost absolutely all of that. And then they stormed the Capitol. And what we've seen is that in order to respond to that, there's been a kind of kid glove approach. And now there are consequences, and Donald Trump may be facing some of those consequences. And when people say this is partisan, we have to start the clock at zero, not half time, but zero. And at zero, what we see is January 6th, people refusing to accept an election, and there are consequences for that in this country.
Today, I have stood where once Jefferson Davis stood and took an oath to my people. It is very appropriate that from this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of the great Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum for freedom. And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
We're still in the realm of the legal justice system. We have actually discussed on the show the fact that Alabama is one of the most gerrymandered states, has been since 2010, I believe. Gerrymandered to basically take about, I believe black voters are close to, if not a little over 30% of the voters. Democrats are about 40% of the voters. And yet the congressional district map is drawn up in such a way that it creates kind of almost what some people are calling an octopus district, in which crams a good portion of the black voters into one district, with tendrils reaching out up to Montgomery and to Selma, and putting them all in one. And the Supreme Court majority, even with the current Supreme Court majority, said, yeah, that's too much. I think they are really worried about the hits they're taking in terms of PR, having already watered down, basically gutted the Voting Rights Act. And here comes Alabama proving we still need a strong Voting Rights Act. I mean, they're blatant about it. So a few months ago, the Supreme Court ruled that they had to draw up a map that had proportionate, so that there were at least 2 majority black districts. Well, the legislature refused to do that. They just came up with another map that is basically of the 7 congressional districts, 6 are majority white and Republican, and 1 is majority black, completely disenfranchising a good portion of the population, white and black. And it's gone back to the court, And this time the federal judge has once again said, no, you don't get it. You can't do this. And so what they're talking about, what these judges are talking about, is just taking it away from the legislature. You can't throw the legislature in jail, right? You can't hold them in contempt, or or if you fine them, you're just fining the taxpayers. I don't know that they could fine all of the individual Republicans who voted for this, but you can, under the history and within the Voting Rights Act framework, set it up so the courts just draw it up for you. And they've asked some sort of council that they've appointed to come up with 3 maps that provide at least 2 districts that are majority Black. And it'll probably get back up to the Supreme Court. Will the Supreme Court stick to its guns? We've got to, there's more than just the issue of the voting rights here, though. I mean, what does the Supreme Court do when a legislature just decides to completely ignore them? And it's a stacked court, for crying out loud. It's a court that's most in your favor, and you're just going to ignore them, and it shows complete disrespect, but they don't care. I think part of it is they wanted to go through another round, so maybe they think they can delay it long enough so that the 2024 elections, they'll still only have 1 Democrat in there. So it might be that they see the writings on the wall and it's a delay tactic, but I don't know. Maybe there's other agendas at work here. Aaron?
So I think when it comes to this particular instance, the take that really struck me comes from the Atlantic, and it kind of wraps up where you were just sitting, which is that it's really remarkable that the court is so stacked given its history. Remember that part of the reason that Trump got one of the appointments that he got was because Mitch McConnell in the Senate refused for a long period of time to let Obama appoint a Supreme Court justice. And this was a huge departure from history.
For a year.
This was massive. And that created a whole extra seat that Donald Trump got to fill. And from that point on, when we take a look at the narrative from the right, it continues to be dissatisfied. It continues to say that it is the left that is the problem when it comes to the court. And here we have to look to the way that they're responding to the investigations into Judge Clarence Thomas and the ways that Justice Clarence Thomas and like all of the ways that he's potentially not reporting benefits that he's getting from billionaires again and again and again. That kind of critique and like the suggestion that maybe Supreme Court justices should have ethics regulations. Like, I am an employee of the state of California because I work for the CSU. I tell my students if they want to give me a present, it has to be less than $50 or I can lose my job. If I were a Supreme Court justice, they could fly me anywhere they want on their airplane for free. And that's a very different situation. And in this situation, the worry is that if you give me an expensive present, I'll judge your speech a little unfairly. You gave me that really sweet poster, so now I'm going to give you an A on your public speech. Well, what happens at the Supreme Court? This is an individual that is deciding what the Constitution means. And when we start investigating the ethics violations or potential or alleged ethics violations, that is politicizing the court. It's attacking the court. The way that Brett Kavanaugh was treated is claimed to be beyond reproach, but here we have an alleged abuser, like a very explicit history and sets of evidence that are plenty. And here too, we could look at Clarence Thomas. And I think that they frame that as attacks on the court. Meanwhile, the state of Alabama is just ignoring what the Supreme Court says, just ignoring it, just saying we're not going to do that. And forcing what's, this special master that you're talking about, and then taking that as the talking points war that our districts are basically being drawn by some outside authority. That's deeply corrosive to the heart of the institution of what the Supreme Court is supposed to do. And it's not even breaking coverage. The Atlantic points out that like the Wall Street Journal and folks like this, typically like the bastion of like, protect the court and the folks that are looking down their nose at some of these investigations into Clarence Thomas and things, they're just not even covering it. They're not saying anything at all about it. And that's pretty radical. The article says that what this means is that the legitimacy of the Supreme Court has absolutely nothing to do with any question of corruption or any question of the rule of law. It has to do with what the right thinks the court should say. And ultimately, that's the reality of the Constitution. And we see that in the prior segment, too.
Yeah, it is in effect a constitutional crisis that Alabama has
Yes.
created. We've had this before. Andrew Jackson actually refused
Right.
to honor a Supreme Court decision upholding Native American treaties,
Yeah.
and he just said, "Well, the Supreme Court doesn't have an army to send after me, do they?" I mean, he was belligerent about it.
Right.
And as far as I'm concerned, that was a coup because there were no consequences for it. And it set a very bad precedent. Alabama, they're feeling like there's no consequences for it, and so they're again. I think they're trying to delay, but the court appointed experts. There have been experts appointed to draw the new map for the 2024 elections, and they're hoping that the Supreme Court's going to change their mind and intervene and say, well, you don't have that remedy. That's not an appropriate remedy. We don't like the Voting Rights Act. We've had our own basis for ruling. I don't know, and allow them to delay at least until after 2024, which means that the true map that Alabamans are entitled to won't come around until 2026, 6 years after they're supposed to have one. So it's just, and basically, well, that'll be the third election if it happens. But this is a problem. This is a problem when you've got a new ideology that's, I don't even know if I want to call it an ideology, but that is anti-system in a bizarre way, that it's basically anything that serves the interests of Trump or affects it. That's really what is at issue here. Is this will be they're basically saying this will be one less Republican in the House, and it's a strict power question, and again, setting very bad precedent. There have to be consequences. And I don't know what the court can do here, and we'll see if the Supreme Court even holds up. If Roberts and Kavanaugh even stick to their guns on this.
One of the things that David Frank says on this show quite a bit that I really value and that I've started looking for is that the new court that we have now is going to begin to radically roll back the administrative state. We're just going to see a drastic reinterpretation. And here, too, the Atlantic article talks about how there's this perception, and it's a misguided one, that the court now is undoing a bunch of, quote, progressive or liberal mistakes that were made. We're talking about decisions like Obergefell and things that like give same-sex marriage rights to folks and the Voting Rights Act. They're like, these are all progressive policies. And for a period of time, the court got real progressive and they started doing all this progressive stuff and they started overreaching. And so now the court is going to overreach in a bunch of very systematic ways in order to like go for neutral. And Roberts is kind of terrified of the fact that the court looks deeply conservative. And I think that that makes sense given the history of this court. And what that means is that for every 2 steps backwards that he takes, he'll try to take 1 step forwards so that he can be like, look, we're not a conservative court. We did this one thing. We didn't totally gut the Voting Rights Act. We did this one thing. And this one thing could be temporary because Kavanaugh may not vote the way that we want him to vote the second time around, as you mentioned. And whether or not the Supreme Court really sticks to its guns and says, no, like the Voting Rights Act should have some teeth, a tooth, one little tiny molar that can't pierce a thing, but maybe could grind up some human rights for the democracy in Georgia. Like, as long as like that is a possibility, I suppose maybe there's some hope. But the problem is that when you look at how quickly the backstepping is happening, that's not enough. And I've said this enough, a couple times on this show, which is that if Roberts really wanted to fight to the middle, he'd have to become that kind of liberal progressive justice because we see so much backsliding in so many areas. And instead, what he's doing is 2 steps backwards, 1 step forward, followed by 2 steps backwards. So I suspect the Voting Rights Act is going to continue to really bleed out. This is a temporary and I do think somewhat toothless consolation prize in that debate.
It's kind of amazing because for many years, Republicans were actually had the hubris to try to take credit for the civil rights movement. I mean, they
Yes.
still do, kind of.
Yes.
You'll hear people say Dr. King was registered Republican. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. But Republicans were different back then. Many of them
Right.
did vote for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, but they would be considered rhinos today, right? Republican in name only. That's back when you actually had liberal people in the Republican Party in the Northeast and some other parts of the country. So it's just, but they, at this point, it's like, oh no, well, we don't need the Voting Rights Act anymore. It was good back then, but we don't have that kind of racism in the country anymore. So it's, but again, then here comes Alabama to completely undermine their argument there. I mean, it's pretty hard, and one of the things that Roberts is probably going to be mad at them, not so much that they're trying to disenfranchise black people, but that they're keeping it the racism of it in the news. And they'll come out and they'll say, well, it's not racism, it's political bias. We just know that, we just want to benefit the Republicans, and we're entitled to do that because, political affiliation is not a suspect class. Yeah, but in order to do that, the fact of the matter is, in the Deep South, 90% of all white people vote Republican and 90% of all black people vote Democratic. So you can't separate that from race. The Democrats are the black people. So it doesn't matter that your motive is political rather than out of a sense of superiority or whatever. But this is exactly where we're at with it. And so what will the Supreme Court do? I don't know. Justice Kavanaugh I'm sorry, I keep coming back to this. He was accused by a very credible witness of having raped her or attempted to at a young age, and he's completely denial about it in the sense of entitlement that it never should have been brought up, right?
He should be sorry. You shouldn't be sorry, Eric. He should be sorry.
Well, exactly. Yeah, I know. I hear you. I mean, it's just
you're just stating objective facts. That's what.
Well, so the point is I do think he's probably a rapist, and here we are putting the survival of any sense of voting rights are in his hands because legally speaking, he's one of the least insane people in the SCOTUS majority.
Yeah, it's I think that the legacy of racism in this country is one that is worth really noting, that it was baked into the bread, that racism was not something we refused to talk about. It was something we literally explicitly fought a war over, and that war killed 10% of the U.S. population at the time, if you believe all the sources on that. This was something we were deeply committed to. And if we were going to have a constitution, it was going to have to negotiate this reality. It was going to have to compromise with folks that felt like we had to enslave whole populations of people because of their race. And you can't just blink your eyes and make that go away. And yet that's kind of what we did. We entered Reconstruction and we tried to act like we could just welcome these folks back. Once again, secessionists were given this kind of kid glove treatment because we wanted to just build our union back. And what happened is we saw a just wave of Jim Crow policies that made it impossible for black folks to exist, even if they had so-called legal rights in the area. They couldn't vote, they couldn't shop, they couldn't sleep places when they traveled, they couldn't drive certain towns at night. It was impossible to exist. And so we had to have the civil rights movement. And then we had a couple of decades where we basically said Martin Luther King fixed it and his dream was realized. And the more you talk about it, the bigger of a problem you are. And when you look at it in those terms, it's clear this isn't fixed. This is not fixed. There are still people that are deeply committed to racially segregating politics, not as a question of opinion, but as a structure of how our government should operate. And if the Supreme Court won't stand up for us, then we're in a lot of trouble. And it's going to take, I think, a real offense from the left to potentially restructure the court. Here, too, it's like it's a partisan question, but it's not one that the left is starting. The right has swung the court hard to the right, and we can see that. And if we want a moderate court that reflects all Americans, it's going to take more than John Roberts.
Yes.
Yes, and I will do it on day one. Here's the thing. The cartels are killing tens of thousands of our fellow citizens. You want to talk about a country in decline? You have the cartels controlling a lot of part of your southern border. We have to reestablish the rule of law, and we have to defend our people. The President of the United States has got to use all available powers as Commander-in-Chief to protect our country and to protect the people. So when they're coming across, yes, we're going to use lethal force. Yes, we reserve the right to operate. How many more tens of thousands are we going to let to die? Would I use force? Would I treat them as foreign terrorist organizations? You're darn right I would.
Last topic. Was a hurricane in I was about to say Hawaii, in Florida last week, and a lot of the standard protocols happened, but one thing that didn't happen was Governor DeSantis. Usually in situations like this, after the earthquake happens, you'll have the president and the governor and the other leadership of the state touring. You put bipartisan politics aside. And you acknowledge that unity is needed so that you boost the confidence of people who've lost their homes, who've lost friends or family, and you want to boost the confidence that there is a unified effort to get things done, to bring the state back to what it was. Well, in the past, it didn't matter what the politics were. The governors would meet with the president no matter what their party was. Chris Christie met with Obama right in the election time, weeks before the election, and he took some flack for it, but he did it. Governor Christie met with Obama. Gavin Newsom, during one of the wildfires, met with Trump. I felt like, that's one of those things that he needed to do. They don't talk about politics or anything like that. They are seen together to show that there is unity among the leadership. Well, Governor DeSantis decided not to do that. His excuses, I don't even want to go into them. They're ridiculous. Oh, about the logistics and all that kind of stuff. You don't do that. You show up. You say, the next day you can say, oh, yeah, he was president. I was just there to respect the office and as a service to the people. But he chose not to do it. And because he is in a tough race where he's losing ground and probably will not regain it. And they're all trying to fight for the MAGA vote, which currently appears to be the majority of the Republican voters, and he just calculated that he could not afford to be seen with Joe Biden because Joe Biden is evil and deep state and whatever, and weaponization, and his son is a criminal, and whatever other reasons there, he decided not to do it. He's taken some flack from Christie, among other people, also for the fact that he voted against aid to New York and New Jersey way back when they were hit with an earthquake when he was in Congress, but not earthquake, hurricane. And now he's begging for federal relief now, and certainly not going to acknowledge that the federal government relief system is a good thing to have. I mean, that it's good that we have FEMA, that it's good that we have a government well enough organized to do what needs to be done to rebuild the communities that were hit by these hurricanes that are increasing in their force due to policies that he doesn't, and questions that he doesn't want to address. At any rate, the question here for you, Aaron, is statesmanship dead? I mean, this is what a governor's job is. It's not all about appeasing your base. It's about representing everybody and acknowledging that the president, whether or not you like him, is the president, and both of you need to do your job. That seems to be out the window.
when you look at statesmanship, in my interpretation, you've got politics and you've got policy, and these are two different ways of looking at the world, and they're going to conflict. And what's popular with the base is not going to be the thing that you need to do some of the times, and you have to try to navigate both of those. And there's a photograph of Ron DeSantis and Joe Biden, and it's from a prior disaster where Joe Biden is talking to some people, and Ron DeSantis is walking in the foreground, and he just looks like Ron DeSantis. He looks bitter and punched out and angry. And that picture just makes Biden look cool and DeSantis look bad. Yeah. And when it comes to Chris Christie, when he met with Obama, Obama like pats him on the shoulder. And, you know, Vivek Ramaswamy like took Christie to task on this in the debate, saying Obama like gave him a hug. They characterize it as a hug. A fundamental part of the politics of the right has been a rejection and a demonization of the leadership on the left. And, you know, this really started in a lot of ways with Clinton, I think. But wow, it kicked into super overdrive with the Obama administration. And now what you see is an effort to create a kind of false equivalency with Trump, perhaps, I don't know. But to answer your question, as far as statesmanship, the politics part is alive and well. I think Ron DeSantis knows he doesn't look good in a picture with Biden when he's trying to demonize everything Biden is doing. And as far as policy is concerned, it's a ridiculous thing to do. When he says that it's like too much, like there's too much security detail, well, you just doubled it, because now you have the governor's security detail and the president's security detail. Why not just roll with the president? They're pretty good at security. We could just have one efficient security detail, go in the places we need to go to see exactly how bad it is, to, take photo ops, but more importantly to say, hey, Sally, this is Jim. Jim, this is Sally. She works for FEMA. Jim works for the state of Florida. And these people can meet each other other ways. But these moments when the president of the United States brings the full administrative power that they have on their airplane called Air Force One to Florida, and all those people get off that plane, there's just huge policy implications there. And I think Chris Christie is right that DeSantis puts politics over policy when he cannot be in another bad photo op with Joe Biden. And so, you know, he's just going to stick to demonizing Joe Biden and making Joe Biden look bad. And I think that the lead that's buried, this is weird. I get that DeSantis is the governor of Florida, but last time I checked, Florida's most famous resident and Florida's most popular Republican is not Ron DeSantis. It is Donald Trump. That's where Mar-a-Lago is. That's where the guy lives. Like, yeah, he was never elected to represent Florida. That's not like, you know, his thing, but he was the president of the United States, and he pretends he still is the president of the United States. And I think in those contexts, the fact that he not only snubbed Biden, he sat at home and did the Truth Social thing, talking about all of his investigations. I don't understand why more people aren't talking about that. The Republican primary leader who lives in Florida spent the weekend during a major hurricane event tweeting about his political rivals and talking about his investigations. And the media question is, why didn't Ron DeSantis meet with Joe Biden? It's like, right. Well, like the real question is, how bad is statesmanship or statespersonship when it comes to the legacies of Donald Trump and the ways that DeSantis is not even the front runner?
We should point out that Republican Senator Rick Scott did meet with
correct
Biden, because, you know, whatever else you want to say about him, he is, you know, takes the position of leader seriously enough. He's probably going to take flack for it. He probably can't be elected president now. But, you know, I don't know if he was ever thinking that, but it's just but that, you know, that is. And I wonder if DeSantis thinks that he was breaking solidarity.
Yeah, I think it's worth emphasizing that when we look at MAGA and Trump politics, we don't know where we are in the moment. Maybe we're right before a huge resurgence, and this is all going to sound naive, and I'm going to wish I hadn't said it. But I do feel like we could be seeing a kind of crest where you look at folks like Matt Gaetz, who's suddenly very infatuated. He's always been infatuated with Ocasio-Cortez, but he's trying to reach across the aisle in very explicit ways to create bipartisan agreement. We see weird bipartisan agreement on busting up monopolies. We see weird bipartisan agreement on unidentified aerial phenomenon. Okay, great. Let's get behind that as two parties. Let's do it. There are a few places. I read somewhere that like 90% of the bills that have been passed, which isn't many, but 90% of the ones that have been passed had bipartisan agreement. I think that the politic and the brand of Trumpism is this kind of red hot Biden, whoever's in charge of the Democrats, they're the enemy and they're Satan and you can't be in a picture with Satan. And so it's like that's the kind of brand. But I think when it comes to trying to enact policy, they're realizing that is just not how a democracy works, especially if 2/3 of the country think your brand is radioactive and bad. You can't do the stuff you need to do unless you can win a majority in every county across the land, and they're not doing that. They're getting wrecked. And so what they're starting to do is try to have it both ways. And Ron DeSantis in this particular instant, I think, is like getting called out on that. Like he's not trying to compromise. He's just trying to run the Trumpist won't even pretend thing. But he's not even the main brand in the party in that capacity. So
no, it's we talk about what do Republicans stand for? What is the right wing standing for these days? I mean, I remember when the right wing was the advocate of free enterprise. Where is the von Mises Institute, the Friedmans, and the F.A. Hayeks? They seem to have disappeared, because I was in a discussion recently about the fact that Texas legislature basically passed a law that puts a tax on electric cars, EVs. You've got a fee that you have to pay that nobody else has to pay, and in other states, it's been justified on the basis, they're not paying their share of the gas tax on the roads, but the gas tax is almost nothing in Texas. So It's basically just punitive against cars. So electric cars. So I talked to somebody I know who is kind of a MAGA person, and I say, this is interference with the economy. It's like, well, yes, but in Texas, they've got the oil industry. They need to protect the oil industry. It's like, but that's not what Republicans and what the conservative ideologies used to say. They used to say, stay out of the government. You can only mess with the government. It's the economies are this ecological thing that flourishes on an invisible hand, and you've got to stay out of it. They're not even advocating that anymore, and it's kind of interesting because I hate to use the word fascism to describe things, but it's real important to point out that fascism is a form of conservatism that is statist, right? It's not necessarily free enterprise. It's certainly for rich people being able to benefit. Hitler privatized 90% of the public industries by 1939. A lot of people don't like to acknowledge that, but socialism is in the word, right? But I'm getting off track here. But I'm looking at this. You've got isolationism. There's no more wanting to get involved in other countries, even communist apparently. And there's and it's not about free speech. So the culture wars have not free speech, free enterprise. Culture wars have taken precedence over the the F.A. Hayek brand of conservatism. It's not about policy anymore. It's about tribalism.
It's a politics of outrage, and it's a politics that demonizes fellow Americans in ways that really are not unique, but that we really haven't seen in a long time, as far as I understand it. There was this kind of shared understanding that the United States of America existed because we did, in fact, need each other. Florida may not admit it, but they need Montana, and Montana won't admit it, but they do need Florida. If you want fruit in Montana, you need Florida. And if Floridians want hurricane money from people that have never even seen a hurricane, then Montana is a good place to look because they're untouched by that hurricane. They don't care about hurricanes in Montana. And I think that what's interesting to me and what does give me some hope is that while the United States will have deep and destructive and meaningful swings toward fascism. Hitler was inspired by the United States in so many ways. He looked up to our capitalism. He looked up to our media. He definitely looked up to our news and the ways that we reported facts that we created, in particular with regards to like settler colonialism and things. It's no coincidence that there's a fascistic trend in this country, and that on some level, Ron DeSantis, when you look at his gun politics, the other lurking variable here is the way that Biden and DeSantis have responded to the Jacksonville shooting. Right? DeSantis tried to speak to this, and he was rightly confronted by people that said that his policies and his politics are in part responsible for that kind of hate.
He was booed.
When you look at the ways that he tries to explain enslavement in high schools, and when you look at his gun policies, I think that's a pretty, short, sturdy bridge to get from shootings like that to policies like that. And I think that when Biden reached out, one of the things he emphasized, according to the White House transcript of the conversations with Ron DeSantis, was like, we're ready to support Jacksonville. We're here for that. And I think that that's just a bad look for DeSantis, because he's trying to win that fascist vote. He's trying to win the Confederate vote. People will say I'm being hyperbolic, but this is just basic history in our country, if we're willing to be honest. And the one consolation I have is that apparently democracy is rejecting it. You do have to create octopus gerrymandered districts in order to sustain that. And right now what we're seeing is even that may not be enough.
That's right. Yeah, no, I mean, by all rights, Republicans should have a much bigger majority in Congress. If this
Democrats should have a much bigger majority in Congress.
But I'm talking about with the current gerrymandering.
That's a good point. Yeah. Well, the red wave, right? Where did the red wave go?
because they were already spent. We talked about it. They gerrymandered so much they can't gerrymander anymore. You can't have no districts, Democratic districts in Alabama. But we are at this point where statesmanship just isn't an issue for certain people. Now, I don't think all governors would do this. I don't want to say all Republican governors would do this. I don't think Will Hurd would do it, for instance. I got my differences with him, but he is a statesman, right? The
front runners would do this for sure.
Yeah, well, because they have to. And it's but it does appear that, at least for the time being, concept of bipartisan, forget it. That's bad news. Anyway, that's all we can talk about it for today, but I'm sure it's going to come up again in one form or another.
Eeny, meeny, chili, beany, the spirits are about to speak.
Are they friendly spirits?
Friendly? Just listen.
Well, this brings us to predictions. Aaron, what do you got for us?
Well, I always come unprepared in this capacity, and that makes my predictions kind of a shot in the dark. And I'm 1 for like 4 on this show. But Sean Hannity leaving Fox is like my victory that I will take to my grave. My prediction here is kind of wild. I think DeSantis might drop out. I know it sounds really wild right now. It makes no sense, especially with Trump facing potential conviction and all of that. But the dude is just having a rocky ride. And if he wants to continue to exist in politics, he can't keep looking this bad on the main stage. And he knows he will not catch Trump. He will not. So what's the point?
And he's not going to be selected for VP. So
no. No. Yeah, Trump and DeSanctimonious. That sign doesn't work. No.
All right. I'm going to go to another court decision we've been discussing a lot today. But today, a federal court judge in Texas has ordered the governor to remove the razor wire that's underwater and supported by buoys. They have already begun to do that. They probably will appeal that. In fact, I'm certain they will. But I also think that's razor wire is, which has already cut up a number of people. People have needed staples to heal. It possibly killed a woman. We don't know. My guess is that, yes, it will be appealed. But I think, again, this is one of those things that the Roberts type of people, and maybe even the Kavanaughs, really don't want to. Razor wire is not a good image outside of Texas, and probably not something that they want to push, especially if they are going to make any kind of a play for the Latino vote. So that is my prediction, that it will be rejected and that this will stand. No more razor wire in the water, at least for now.
I told you razor wire buoys is just a tough sell communication wise. I just don't know that that's got legs.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Aaron, for being with us. Dr. Aaron Donaldson will probably be back another time soon. But until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.